3 years ago, I pulled 48 onions out of a single 4-foot row in my experiment patch. Total cost, $2 in grocery store onions. No seeds, no sets, no nursery order. When a neighbor asked me why he had never heard of the method, I went looking for the answer and found a 1947 USDA quarantine action, expanded since by individual state departments of agriculture, that today blocks the commercial sale of these onion plants in 17 states. The plant is not banned. The propagation method is not banned, but the supply chain that would have brought it to your local garden center was strangled 80 years ago. Stay with me, because I will show you the cut Daniel makes on the root plate, and the bonus trick Rebecca uses to keep the harvest going through February. Let me start with the regulatory piece, because the suppression story here is not the kind of thing you can wave a hand at. In 1947, the USDA expanded a quarantine framework that had been built to control two real fungal problems in the commercial onion industry: onion smut, Urocystis sepulae, and white rot, Sclerotium sepivorum. Both are nasty soil-borne diseases, and both ride along on vegetatively propagated allium planting stock. That is the regulatory category that matters here. Anything propagated from a bulb rather than from true seed got swept into the same compliance bucket. Onion sets, garlic, shallots, and the plant I am about to walk you through. Over the decades that followed, individual state departments of agriculture layered their own restrictions on top of the federal framework. The biggest commercial onion-producing states had the biggest say in how this played out: California, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington especially, with another cluster of states across the Midwest, the Northeast, and the South stacking restrictions of their own. By the time you add them all up, you land at 17 states where the commercial sale of these onion plants is effectively blocked today. Not the growing of them, not the sharing of them between gardeners, the commercial supply chain that would have moved them from a wholesale grower to your local garden center. I want to be honest with you about the stakes here, because this is not abstract. The average American home gardener spends somewhere between $35 and $75 a year on onion sets and onion seed every spring, forever. That is a recurring tax on a kitchen garden that did not have to exist, because the plant we are about to talk about produces its own next year's planting stock. For free. Perpetually. It used to sit in nearly every Ohio and Pennsylvania farm garden in 1900. Today, most American gardeners have never seen one and could not buy one if they tried. I gardened on this property for 25 years before I saw my first one. 25 years, I had read the university extension bulletins, I had ordered from the catalogs, I had grown onions every single summer, and I had no idea this plant existed until one October afternoon around 2008, when Daniel reached into a wooden seed-saving box on his porch and pulled out a handful. The plant is not banned, the propagation method is not banned, but the supply chain that would have brought it to you was strangled 80 years ago, and it never came back. So let me tell you what the plant is, because if you have not heard the name before, you are not alone. I had not either for the first half of my gardening life. The plant is the potato onion, Allium cepa aggregatum group. You will also hear it called the multiplier onion or the hill onion, depending on what part of the country the gardener grew up in. The Amish farmers I visit in Holmes County mostly just call it the multiplier, because that's what it does. You plant one bulb, you harvest a cluster. Now, before I go any further, I want to be honest with you, because the title of this video says kitchen scrap, and the forbidden audience is sharp enough to catch the slippage if I leave it there. So let me clarify. The $2 I spent 3 years ago was not on a bag of yellow storage onions from the produce aisle of the Walmart in Millersburg. If you take a regular grocery store onion home and plant it, you will get one onion back. Maybe a flowering scape if it bolts. You will not get the divide and multiply behavior I am about to describe, because almost every onion in the American produce supply is an F1 hybrid, bred for storage and uniformity. They are not built to multiply, they are built to sit on a pallet and look like every other onion on the pallet. What I bought for $2 was 6 sprouting bulbs from a farmer's market booth in Berlin, Ohio, sitting on a folding table next to a stack of jam jars and a sign written in pencil. The woman at the booth, she was not Amish, She was an English neighbor of one of the Amish farms north of town, sold them to me for about 30 cents apiece because they had pushed green tops out of the basket and she could not sell them as eating onions anymore. To her, they were spoiled inventory. To me, once Daniel had told me what to look for, they were the entire planting stock for the next 3 decades of my onion bed. And that is the first reason you will not find this at your local garden center. The only place to source these is private hands, a farmer's market booth, an Amish family with a seed-saving box on the porch, a neighbor whose grandmother kept a row going since 1962 and who will give you 6 bulbs in a paper sack if you ask politely. The supply chain that would have shipped potato onion stock to a Lowe's garden center in March was strangled in the late 1940s, and the plant retreated into the gardens it was already living in. That is where it stayed. That is where it still is. If you want one, you have to find a person, not a product. All right, let us keep going, because the next layer is the part I find most interesting as a biology teacher, and it is the part that explains why the suppression couldn't actually finish the job. Now here is where it gets interesting. A regular onion, the kind you grow from a seed packet or a bag of sets, is what botanists call a true seed crop. You plant the seed. The plant grows. At the end of the season, you get 1 bulb, and if you let that bulb stay in the ground a second year, it will throw up a flowering scape, set seed, and the next generation comes from the seed, the genetic shuffle. Every seed-grown onion is a little different from its parent. The potato onion does not work that way. The potato onion reproduces vegetatively. What that means in plain English is this: when you plant a single starter bulb in October, that bulb sits in the ground over winter, and in early spring, instead of pushing up 1 growing point the way a regular onion does, it pushes up 6, sometimes 7, sometimes 9. Each of those growing points sits on the same basal plate, that flat, slightly concave disc on the underside of the bulb that the roots come out of, and each one becomes its own daughter bulb over the course of the spring and summer. By July, what you started with as 1 bulb is a tight cluster of 6 to 9 fully formed daughter bulbs, all sharing 1 root system, all the same genetics as the mother. You pull the cluster, separate the daughters, and you have your harvest. If that mechanism sounds familiar, it should. It is exactly what garlic does. A garlic head is a basal plate with multiple cloves arranged around it, all genetically identical to the parent. The potato onion runs the same biological program, vegetative division off a single basal plate. But instead of expressing it as cloves tucked inside a papery wrapper, it expresses it as a cluster of full-sized daughter bulbs sitting side by side. Same logic. Different package. I taught earth science and biology for 30 years before I retired, and I have to say, the first time Daniel walked me through what was happening underneath the soil, I felt like I should have already known this. The mechanism is not exotic. It is in textbooks. It is in horticulture journals. But it is not in the average gardening column, because the average gardening column assumes you bought your onion sets from a commercial nursery and you are going to throw them away in July and buy new ones next year. And that biology, that vegetative reproduction off the basal plate, is the feature that kept this plant alive through 80 years of regulatory neglect. It did not need a seed catalog. It did not need a nursery middleman. It did not need a State Department of Agriculture inspector to certify a shipment. It propagated itself year after year in the gardens it was already in. Every fall, the gardener who had it pulled 6 bulbs out of the harvest basket, set them aside, and replanted them in October. Those 6 became 36. 36 became 200. The plant carried itself through the entire post-war regulatory regime by simply staying inside private fences, on private soil, never crossing a state line through commerce. The 1947 quarantine was written for things that moved on trucks. This plant moved in paper sacks, hand to hand, at barn raisings and church suppers and farmers' market booths. They could not regulate it because they could not see it. Daniel said it to me one afternoon a few years back, leaning on a fence post while I was taking notes. He said most folks who plant onions don't trust the plant to figure it out. That is the whole sentence. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. What he meant, and what I confirmed later in a horticulture textbook I pulled off the shelf in my garage, is that a healthy potato onion is going to do this whether you fuss with it or not. It does not need fertilizer at planting. It does not need a starter solution. It does not need any of the inputs the modern allium production system is built around. Plant it in decent soil at the right depth at the right time of year, and it will divide itself for you while you go do something else. That is the kind of plant that survives a regulatory framework, because it does not interact with the regulatory framework at all. Now let me get into the actual numbers, because I know that is what most of you are here for, and I want to walk you through exactly what happened in my experiment patch over the last 3 growing seasons. This is where the 48 onions out of a 4-foot row stops being a hook number and starts being a protocol you can copy. I tried this in my experiment patch. The 4x16-foot bed I keep separate from the main garden, specifically so I can test new methods before I commit to them, starting in the fall of 2021. 6 starter bulbs, the ones I bought at that farmer's market booth in Berlin. I planted them on October 12th. The exact date matters less than the principle, which is roughly 4 weeks before the ground freezes solid in Zone 6A, so the bulbs have time to push roots before dormancy, but not enough warm soil to push tops that will get killed off in November. Daniel plants on his own land within a week of the same date. Eli, 8 miles away on his market garden, plants closer to October 5th. Both of them have been doing it for so long that the date has become a feel rather than a calendar item. 8-inch spacing, rows 12 inches apart, 4-inch planting depth, pointy end up, basal plate down. That spacing is closer than the University Extension bulletins recommend for storage onions, and that gap between what the bulletins say and what Daniel does is the second reason you won't find this method in the standard advice column. The bulletins assume you bought commercial sets, and commercial sets behave differently than a multiplier line that has been selected for tight clustering across generations. I did not fertilize at planting. That part surprised me the first time. I had been raised on the idea that alliums are heavy feeders and you bury a handful of bone meal under every set. Daniel does not. He works 2 inches of finished compost into the bed before he plants, and that is it until spring. The reasoning is biological, and it is the kind of thing that makes sense the moment a biology teacher hears it. A bulb planted in October is not actively feeding. It is pushing roots into cold soil and storing what it already has. Heavy nitrogen at fall planting either burns young root tissue or leaches out of the bed in winter rain. Both outcomes cost you, so you wait. After the first hard frost, which in my Holmes County yard runs early November, I mulched the row with 3 inches of clean straw, not leaves which mat down and trap too much moisture against the bulb. Straw, loose, hollow, insulating. That mulch stayed on through January and February and pulled back in March as the soil warmed. In early April, when the green tips were maybe 2 inches above the soil line, I side-dressed each linear foot of the row with about a cup of composted chicken manure from my own coop. 1 cup per linear foot, that is the only feeding the row got the entire season. 4 feet of row, 4 cups of manure, applied once. By the second week of April, the green tops had thickened from chive width to pencil width, and by mid-May, each parent bulb was visibly bulging at the soil line with the daughter cluster forming around it. The tops fell on July 18th, 2022. I remember the date because I wrote it in the field notebook the same way I taught my students to record observations, date, conditions, what I saw. When the tops fall on an allium, that is the plant telling you the bulbs have stopped growing and started curing in the ground. I left them another 5 days, then lifted the whole row with a fork. 48 mature bulbs. I weighed them. I counted them twice because the count surprised me. Sizes ranged from about 1.5 inches across to a hair over 2.5 inches across, which is a normal distribution for this plant. Potato onions cluster in the small to medium storage range, not the giant Spanish onion range that grocery stores have trained us to expect. 6 starter bulbs in, 48 bulbs out. I set 6 aside on the curing rack in the garage to replant the following October. The other 42 went into the kitchen, the giveaway basket, and a small braid I hung from a nail in the pantry. For about the price of 2 grocery store onions, I have not bought planting stock in 3 years, and I will not ever again. That is the kind of math that does not survive a commercial supply chain, because a supply chain needs you to come back next spring and pay again. Now here's where it gets interesting. Everything I just walked through, the spacing, the depth, the timing, the side dress, is what most surviving potato onion growers will tell you if you ask. It is the basic protocol. There's one more layer that even people who grow this plant usually don't know, and it is the cut Daniel makes on the root plate. I will walk you through it the way Daniel walked me through it, the first October he let me plant alongside him. He had a small wooden box of starter bulbs on a stool next to the row. He had a paring knife, nothing special, the same kind of knife Rebecca uses to skin apples, and a clean rag draped over his knee. He picked up a bulb, turned it root plate up in his palm, and made 2 shallow cuts across the basal plate. One cut, then a second cut perpendicular to it, forming a plus sign on the underside of the bulb. The cuts were shallow, about 1/8 of an inch deep, no deeper. He did not slice into the bulb tissue itself. He scored the corky disc at the bottom where the roots come out, and that was it. Then he set the bulb in the planting hole and moved on to the next one. I asked him why. He said, and I'm quoting this from my notebook because I wrote it down that afternoon, "Most folks who plant onions don't trust the plant to figure it out." That is the whole explanation he offered. I went home and tested it. 2 seasons in the experiment patch, side by side. 1 row cut, 1 row uncut. Same starter stock, same spacing, same soil, same side dress, same harvest date. The cut row averaged 8.4 daughter bulbs per parent. The uncut row averaged 6.1, 2 1/3 extra bulbs per planted bulb. Across a 4-foot row, that is the difference between 48 bulbs and roughly 35. Afterward, I went to the horticulture journals and looked up what Daniel was doing without using Daniel's words. Wounding the basal plate triggers a localized auxin and cytokinin response. Those are the 2 plant hormones that govern lateral meristem activation, which in plain English means the chemical signal that tells the plant to make more growth points instead of just one. The cut tells the plant the central meristem has been damaged, and the plant compensates by activating more lateral meristems around the wound. Daniel did not use those words. He did not need to. He had watched his father do it on the same farm 70 years ago, and his father had watched his father. Timing matters. The cut has to happen within 24 hours of planting. If you cut the bulbs and leave them sitting on the workbench for 3 days, the wound will desiccate or rot, and you will lose the bulb. Cut, plant, cover, done. Same afternoon. That is why Daniel keeps the paring knife and the planting box together. He cuts as he plants, 1 bulb at a time, never a tray of bulbs cut in advance. This is the kind of detail that lives in one farmer's hands and never makes it into a university extension bulletin because the bulletin assumes you bought your sets from a commercial nursery and there is nothing on the bottom of a commercial set worth cutting. The cut belongs to a propagation system the bulletin does not acknowledge exists. If you are finding this useful and you want more of these deep dives into what the Amish know that most modern gardeners have forgotten, go ahead and subscribe. I have been working through Daniel's full seed-saving system on this channel. His garlic clove grading and the shallot multiplier line he has kept going on his farm for 40 years are both coming up in the next few videos. Subscribe and you will catch them. Now, let me come back to the suppression frame because I want to give you the full picture of what happened in 1947 and why this plant disappeared from the catalogs. The 1947 action was not in itself an evil conspiracy against home gardeners. I want to be honest about that. It was a regulatory expansion built on top of 2 real diseases, onion smut, which is Urocystis sepuli, and white rot, which is Sclerotium cepivorum. Both are genuine soil-borne pathogens that can devastate a commercial onion field, and both were a particular problem in the large set-producing operations in California, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington in the 1940s. The expansion swept all vegetatively propagated allium planting stock into a single regulatory category. If your nursery wanted to ship allium planting stock across a state line, you had to comply with the certification framework: soil testing, batch inspection, paperwork, fees. That was reasonable for commercial set producers shipping millions of pounds annually. It was unreasonable for the potato onion. Potato onions were already a tiny fraction of the commercial allium market in 1947. The handful of nurseries that still carried them did the math after the certification framework came in. The cost to certify a potato onion line under the new rules ran higher than the entire annual market for the plant. Nurseries dropped the line, not because anyone told them to, because the math made it impossible. Within a generation, the catalogs went silent. By 1970, you could not find a potato onion in a commercial seed catalog in the United States with any consistency. By 1990, most American gardeners had never heard of the plant. State departments of agriculture in 17 states layered additional restrictions over the following decades: California, Idaho, Oregon, Washington at the commercial onion state level, plus New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, and southern states like Texas and Georgia, and each layer made commercial reintroduction a little less economic. The counter-argument is the obvious one, and I want to grant it. Smut and white rot were real. Quarantine had a legitimate disease control purpose. I am not arguing the regulators were malicious. I am pointing out that the regulation made no provision, none, for a plant whose entire life cycle stayed inside a private garden. There was no exemption for vegetatively propagated stock that never crossed a state line, never entered a commercial nursery, never left the hands of the family that grew it. The plant lived. The supply chain that would have brought it to your local garden center died. The cost to you, the home gardener, is small per year and large per lifetime, $30 to $75 a year on onion sets and seed. Over 30 years of gardening, that is more than $1,500 in planting stock you could have grown yourself perpetually from a one-time $2 purchase. Eli, 8 miles from me, has kept a separate potato onion line going on his market garden for about 50 years. He has not bought a planting onion in any of those 50 years. He confirmed Daniel's numbers when I asked him independently. 2 farms, 2 communities of Amish gardeners working in parallel without coordinating, both producing the same yield curve from the same plant. I gardened for 25 years before I knew this plant existed. I do not think that was an accident. That brings me to Rebecca, and the bonus I promised at the top of the video. I spent an October afternoon in 2019 in Rebecca's kitchen and out at her cold frame, taking notes, the way I taught my students to take notes: date, location, technique, observations, questions to follow up. Daniel had pointed me to her because Rebecca does something with potato onions that he does not. Daniel grows them for the bulb harvest in July. Rebecca grows a second separate planting for fresh greens through October, through November, through December, through January, and into late February. No curing, no root cellar, no electricity. Fresh allium tops cut with kitchen scissors on a Tuesday in February. Here is her protocol, exactly as I wrote it down. She stages a second planting in early August, late summer in Holmes County, Zone 6A. If you are colder, push it to late July. If you are warmer, late August. The bulbs go into a cold frame, not the open garden. Spacing is 2 inches between bulbs. That is dense. 30 to 40 bulbs per square foot. Much closer than the main July crop because Rebecca is not after mature daughter bulbs here. She is after greens. Planting depth is 3 inches, slightly shallower than the main crop, again because the goal is the tops, not the bulb. Watering is sparing, about 1 cup per square foot per week through the fall, less once the frame closes for the season. She closes the glazing once nighttime lows drop below 25 degrees, and she vents on sunny days when the inside of the frame climbs above 40. Closed frames in October sun will cook a green onion bed faster than you would believe. I learned that one the hard way in my own first cold frame. Rebecca did not. The harvest technique is what makes the method continuous. She does not pull the bulbs. She snips the greens with kitchen scissors about 2 inches above the bulb. The bulb regrows new tops in 10 to 14 days. The same bulb gets harvested 4 to 6 times across the winter. Her 4x4 cold frame produces enough green onions to keep the kitchen supplied from October through late February. Now, the biology, because I cannot help myself. Vegetatively propagated bulbs do not need vernalization to push green growth. A seed-grown allium needs cold exposure to break dormancy. A clone of a clone of a clone, like a potato onion daughter, will push fresh tops whenever the soil temperature is above about 38 degrees. A closed cold frame in Zone 6A holds soil temperature above 38 for most of the winter. That is the whole mechanism. There is no trick beyond the biology of a plant doing what it has always done in a box that keeps the soil from freezing. Rebecca said something that afternoon that has stayed in my notebook ever since. I asked her why she did not just freeze a year's worth of green onions in August and call it done. She looked at me the way a patient aunt looks at a slow nephew and said, "If you have to thaw it before you cook with it, it isn't really fresh." And here's the suppression beat. Nobody could have sold this as a product. Nobody at a garden center could have offered you a cold frame multiplier green onion line, because it is not a line. It is a layered seasonal use of a vegetatively propagated plant that lives only in private practice. A supply chain cannot package a habit. The 1947 quarantine framework was never going to reach this kind of knowledge because this kind of knowledge does not move through commerce. It moves from Rebecca's kitchen table to my field notebook to your video screen, one afternoon at a time. More from Rebecca's kitchen coming on the channel, her vinegar pickling, the layout of her root cellar, and the herb and allium braids she puts up every fall. If you want those deep dives, go ahead and tap subscribe now. Take a second to find the button. I will wait. There is no rush. So, that is the picture. The potato onion is a vegetatively propagated allium that turns 6 bulbs into 48 in a single season for the price of $2. Once. Daniel's shallow cross-cut on the basal plate, performed within 24 hours of fall planting, will push the average daughter count from 6 to over 8. Rebecca's late summer cold frame planting will keep fresh allium greens on your kitchen counter from October through late February, no electricity required. None of these methods are illegal. None of them are mystical. All 3 of them are absent from your local garden center because the supply chain that would have carried them was strangled 80 years ago by a regulatory framework written for someone else's problem. Now you have a perpetual onion supply that does not depend on a catalog, a regulation, or a freight truck. That is the part that I think matters. There are other plants on this same shelf, heirloom shallot lines that have been kept in private hands for 150 years, Amish seed-saving methods that bypass the commercial seed market entirely. I will be walking through those in future videos the same way I walked through this one. Try it on a single bed this season. Drop a note in the comments and let me know how it goes. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.